What facts about history will never be taught in school? Captain Bartholomew Roberts, the pirate, gave his pirate crew a bedtime. Gotta have your 8 hours so you can make that pillaging tomorrow. Ah yes, the dreaded pirate Roberts. He'll most likely kill you in the morning, because while you're still all groggy and bleary-eyed, he's well rested and ready to go. The US government went to war in Guatemala over bananas. Several countries actually, although I can't remember if they were all over bananas. See Banana Wars. The Civil War is closely intertwined with the banana issue. Propped up dictators backed by the US in order to cheaply secure agricultural imports, as well as stem the flow of communism and many other reasons, were in constant conflict with other members of the nation. Hitler's nephew served for the US in World War II. Before he served, he actually did a speaking tour using the Hitler's nephew angle to drum up awareness of what the Nazis were doing. When I first heard of him in the early 2000s, he was still alive. Stalin's son killed himself in a concentration camp, yet Stalin mocked him until his death. Actually learned about this in school, even about him not being able to even shoot straight. Well, until I saw Lincoln, I'd never heard of Thaddeus Stevens, who seems to be a much greater believer in the equality of men than many. Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans were our greatest hope for real equality in the US, and those were dashed by the 1870s when they were betrayed by Southern Democrats and moderate Republicans. If we'd jailed or exiled the planter aristocrats and given their land to the freed slaves who'd been working it for 2 centuries, the freedmen could have been integrated into American society on the basis of economic self-sufficiency. Instead, the planter aristocrats were immediately restored to power. A massive campaign of terrorism was initiated to intimidate the freedmen and let them know slavery may be over, but don't get any ideas thinking you're free. And the freedmen were largely rendered into a status of quasi-serfdom as tenant farmers and sharecroppers living on white planters' land. About the lost children of Francoism. These children were abducted from Republican parents who were either in jail or had been assassinated by nationalist troops during the Spanish Civil War and Francoist Spain. These children were then given to families that would practice Catholicism and nationalism. However, this lasted after 1975 when Franco died. But then this practice was already a trafficking business run by nuns, doctors, and nurses. My mum is a lost children, and she has told me that almost no one has found their parents. Same thing happened in Argentina during the Argentine Dirty War. Leftist women had their children snatched and given to loyalists of the junta, while the women were usually killed or disappeared. Similar in Australia with Aboriginal children, but it's taught in schools. They are called the Stolen Generation. I can't remember the year it started or finished though, but it hasn't been in practice for a while. That Argentina pretty much eliminated the black race. They had ways to get rid of the men first, not as much for the women though. Once the male to female ratio drastically dropped, black population, the women were pretty much forced to sleep with white men in order to wash out the black. The black population was so low, the Argentine government pretty much removed the black option as a race. And crazy how they succeed. I'm Argentinian, and I was never formally taught that in school, but it was always mentioned. If the facts I got were right, it's really not that crazy that they succeeded. Slavery wasn't as prominent as it was in other areas. Not saying there weren't any slaves, just that there weren't as many. And they simply put them in the front lines or gave them the riskiest of missions in all wars. Absolutely horrible. There isn't such a strong anti-black sentiment now, thankfully. If anything, racism is worse towards natives and immigrants, and classism is the strongest form of discrimination by far. Ben Franklin once wrote a thorough essay about how it's better to date older women. Very misleading since 1. It's a letter to a friend, and 2. He first tells him to marry and then tries to answer all his arguments against marriage. And then, knowing he's probably not going to take that advice, says, if you really are going to take a mistress, then take an older one. Your comment makes it sound like he's anti-marriage and giving advice in that direction. Central Park in New York was created under eminent domain and raised a predominantly black and Irish community called Seneca Village. Most of the inhabitants were compensated, but many felt that they did not receive fair market value. According to the Louise Chipley Slavelik, author of New York Central Park, the pro-park lobby were largely affluent merchants, bankers, and landowners who wanted a fashionable and safe public place where they and their families could mingle and promenade. Native Americans weren't granted citizenship until the 1920s. Aboriginals, the native owners of Australia, were not even considered human until 1967. Chinese Express Wu Zetian required people to please her orally as a greeting. Now, when we say please her orally, are we talking about kissing or slobbing down on some royal empress coochie? Obviously reciting a poem. How bad the rape of Nanking was. I read up on that a while ago and it left me feeling shocked at just how evil humans can be to other humans. It's possibly one of the worst atrocities mankind has ever committed. Yeah, it's up there with the Holocaust and the Spanish Inquisition. Literally anything to do with Polynesian history. Unless you live in Polynesia or New Zealand. It does get covered in Australia as well, depending on if your school is into it or not. I got to learn it as a kid back in the 90s. Things like how they used stars and currents to navigate the islands, and the migration patterns of how people got to Oceania. It took me an anthropology class in college to learn about human zoos. That is, zoos where white people paid money to see Aboriginal people from various regions in cages. It happened all over the world, including in the Bronx Zoo in like the 1920s. I'd never heard about anything like that in any schooling before that, and I doubt most people have. Surprised no one brought it up, but yeah, the Crystal Palace of London was host to the Grand Expo, which exhibited such human zoos, having Aboriginal people of all locations set up in an exhibit to attempt to demonstrate their living habits and conditions. Really messed up. And definitely a subject usually skimmed over in most schools until you get to degree-level studies, I agree. Human zoos were active until about 1958, in fact. Many people reading this will either have a grandparent or parent who was alive during the existence of these, which really puts it into perspective. The Japanese military kidnapped hundreds, if not thousands, of Korean and Chinese women during World War II and forced them to be sex workers for the Japanese military. Some Japanese women were even drafted to be comfort women, but they didn't know what they were being drafted for until they were there. It's actually a pretty common thing in many wars because the military wants to keep the soldiers pure. By kidnapping these women, they know that they aren't riddled with STDs. It's very sad, especially because when the war is over, many of the camps are cleared and these women are forced to find their way back home without even knowing the war's over. If they aren't too afraid or ashamed to go back home, they're usually turned away from their families because they are so ashamed of what happened. They took Australian girls too. The Tulsa Race Massacre. In the early 1920s, Tulsa, Oklahoma had a very affluent black neighborhood called Black Wall Street. Basically, many African Americans were doing better financially than whites. White folks were angry about their success and wanted their land. An African American was wrongly accused of assault by a white girl, and the whites used this as an excuse to attack the neighborhood, including dropping bombs from World War I era planes. Many were killed and beaten. Over 10,000 people were left homeless due to houses and businesses being burned down. This is the greatest single incident of racial violence in US history. Turkey genocided Armenians. Those stats just kind of get tossed in with World War I, so they don't really stand out. Until you look and see that it didn't have anything to do with the actual war. Hey everyone, it was pretty busy with the Germans. Hey, let's get rid of these Armenians. If you go back far enough, everyone's ancestry contains rape at some point. As someone whose bloodline, so far as I know, is mostly comprised of those who invaded England, I'm not very surprised by this. The Holodomor, Ukrainian genocide, where millions of Ukrainians starved because of government control of farms. In my province, it was taught until my last year of junior high, grade 9, 2009. Our textbooks were surprisingly graphic and showed photos of families that resorted to cannibalism. Now they're pretty much just focusing on Canadian history, from what I understand. John Wilkes Booth's brother saved Lincoln's son Robert Todd Lincoln. Robert Lincoln was traveling by train from New York to Washington. He got off the train during a stop at Jersey City. He saw that the platform was extremely crowded. In order to be polite and wait his turn, he pressed his back to one of the train's cars. About 30 to 60 seconds later, the train started to move. The train wiped him down and dropped him into the space between the platform and train. Abe's son would have died if a stranger hadn't yanked him out of the hole by his collar. The stranger was Edwin Booth, a good actor in the 19th century and the brother of John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was the guy that killed Abe only a few years later. The CIA proposed committing a false flag terror attack, which included shooting down a fake passenger jet as an excuse to invade Cuba. JFK rejected the operation. That the UK caused a famine in Bengal, India during World War II, killing over 2 million indigenous people. How Polish pilots helped to prevent the invasion of Britain during World War II, nor how Britain and France failed to meet the support agreement. Wasn't just Polish, it was guys from every corner of Europe the Nazis were occupying. Sure, but when Stalin prevented Poland from participating in the parade in London, England, turned a blind eye. How there was once a time called 2020 and people went crazy buying all the toilet paper but forgot the condoms. And that, kiddies, is how you were made. It's outrageous! I bought 87 cases of toilet paper and my corona still isn't cured yet.